Hey everyone, and welcome to our April live event with National Quilter Circle. We're really excited to welcome a new guest this month. Kelly Ashton is here with us, so thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Ashley, thanks so much for having me. I've been so looking forward to this.
Of course, I'm glad. So if anyone is tuning in for the first time, Kelly is going to answer your quilting questions over the next hour. So if you have any of those already ready to ask her, please start putting those in the chat box. But I want to start out by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your quilting background.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I have been making quilts for, I'm almost embarrassed to say, but like more than 30 years, a really long time. I was introduced to quilts by my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who was also a quilt maker. And so I knew from the time I was little that I wanted to make quilts. But I started in my early adulthood, or well, probably not even so early, really, if we start counting the years. But I just really fell in love with it. And especially for me, 60-degree shapes are things that I really love working with. I like pretty much any kind of patchwork and some other techniques too, machine applique and that kind of thing. But 60-degree patchwork, like the equilateral triangles that are hanging behind me, are really the shapes that I am just passionate about.
That,
So
that's awesome. And yeah, I think you have just a couple hanging behind you there. I don't want to
yeah,
count them all, but
just a couple.
perfect. All right, well, I'm going to go to our first question that came in here. And Brenda asks, she has a 1980 heirloom quilt from a deceased family member. It's a bow tie quilt, and the blocks are made from cotton print and muslin. The muslin is very discolored. How would you suggest that I launder or wash the quilt? Any temperature, detergent, methods? She's heard of a restoration product, but she doesn't have any experience with it, and so wants to know your thoughts on that.
Well, Brenda, I have to tell you, I have a few heirloom quilts and I haven't done a lot in terms of washing them. And I have some with stains as well. And one of them in particular is one that my grandmother made. And I sort of honestly decided just to leave it that way because for me, it's just sort of part of the nostalgia of that quilt. But I do know that there are a variety of products on the market. And even though I can't tell you specifically, I know that there are some really good products out there to work with. You might check with a local historical society, or if you have any contacts, there are a variety of quilt museums around the country that always have people available. I think that could probably steer you in the right direction if you don't have anybody locally.
Yeah.
But I know there are things available, and I'm sure that they would at least help.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, our next one here, Suzanne asks, she has 6 blocks, which I would like to build up around each one with sashing. She says, my math is not great. In fact, it gives me a headache. But so for somebody who doesn't necessarily want to do the math involved, how would you suggest building up around those blocks?
Oh, Suzanne, I know that math is a true four-letter word for so many quilters. And I have to say, for me, I really like math. And so I appreciate your question. And I don't know if you said how large your blocks were, but oftentimes what I do is measure the block and I will use like a percentage. So let's say, for example, these are 6-inch blocks. I think that usually between a third and a half of the width of the block is a really nice place to start with sashings, so that you get some sort of proportion. So, for example, with your 6-inch, if they were 6-inch blocks, I might decide to go with a 2-inch finished sashing in between.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of gives you at least a little bit of a guideline or a place to start. But honestly, a lot of it is just personal aesthetic. And
Mm-hmm.
so I would audition some different sizes between the blocks and play with it and see what looks good to you because it's your quilt. And if it looks good to you, then it's right. It's right for you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And a fun way to, I think I've done this a little bit too, if you want to audition the size of strips between a block, but you don't want to cut a bunch of different strips, you just lay out a fabric, flat and put your blocks in them and then rearrange them an inch apart or 2 inches apart and 3 inches. And then you can see without having to cut a bunch of strips that you may or may not want to use.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Perfect. All right. Annette says, hi, Kelly, and a very warm welcome to you on Ashton
Thank
NQC.
you.
And then Sandra asks if you have any suggestions on combining 2 different sized hexagons into one top.
Ooh, you're touching on my some of my favorite things. Actually, there really is a pretty easy way to do that. Um, in my book, I dissected a hexagon into a variety of different shapes. And so if you have an equilateral triangle that fits the side of each of those hexagons, you can actually mark it so that you cut that equilateral triangle in half and add your seam allowance. So, don't literally cut it in half, but add the seam allowance and then cut a half plus a seam allowance. And when you add those half equilateral triangles to 4 of the 6 sides, you really create rectangles out of your hexagons. And so that's a great way that you can combine 2 or even more sizes of hexagons, is just by making them into rectangles and then playing with a layout on the floor or on the design board or whatever works. And you can make some all the way from very modernistic looking kinds of quilts to very traditional row quilts, using a variety of sizes of hexagons by doing that.
That's perfect. And I think a lot of times people think of hexagons as only English paper piecing or these little tiny, things that you're doing. So if someone is fairly new to quilting, maybe has only done simple squares, rectangles, maybe has done a few triangles, but is thinking about doing a more complicated shape like a hexagon, what are sort of some of your tips for working with a shape like that?
One of my big tips, and I really recommend this with all the 60-degree family of shapes, hexagons, equilateral triangles, 60-degree diamonds, etc. But really, any time that you're going to be having pieces that have bias edges, I always prep my fabric first before I ever cut it. And what I mean by that is usually I use Mary Ellen's Best Press, for example, but any kind of stabilizing either starch or non-starch alternative or sizing product. And I spritz my fabric generously and then press it with a cotton setting iron with no steam, both sides. And if it doesn't quite get dry and I've got a stack of fabric to do, once I've pressed it on both sides, I just kind of set it aside and let it air dry while I'm doing the rest of my fabrics. But that just really adds some extra stability to your fabric so that once you cut those pieces with bias edges, they're a little bit more stable. It's a little bit less likely that those edges are going to get distorted while you're working with them. Now, there's always the huge debate about whether to pre-wash or not your fabrics. And I have true confessions. I used to be diligent about it, and I'm not so much anymore, in part because the dyeing processes have gotten a lot better, but also in part because it's just a time factor. But so I don't try to influence anybody either way. You got to do your own due diligence. But if you do pre-wash your fabrics, I think that stabilization step is extra important, because then you've washed out all of the sizing that comes with the fabric off the bolt. So I think that's probably one of the best tips I can give you, is just make sure that you stabilize your fabric and then just be gentle when you're working with any kind of bias edges.
Perfect. Absolutely. I see another question that just came in, but I do want to ask you, since you just mentioned it, because you mentioned sizing. And I think sometimes people can confuse sizing that comes on a bolt with, well, does that mean they've already added starch to the fabric or something like that? So can you explain what sizing is and is not?
That's hopefully I can. I'm going to attempt that, and then please feel free to add anything to it. But when a fabric comes to us from the manufacturer, the basic fabric or a cloth is a grade good, and then of course they print it or do whatever they do. And in that process of printing, there are chemicals that get added to the fabric. It helps keep the dyes intact, and whether it's actually added for sizing or not, it ends up giving a little bit of stiffness and stability to the fabric. Mm-hmm. So if you have anything more specific to add, Ashley, please feel free.
No, that's exactly, we have the exact same understanding of it. I think sometimes I think people just hear that word and sizing is kind of a weird term. If you come with like a garment background, you think, oh, you're sizing the fabric? What is this? So it's a little bit of a tricky word, but I think you described it perfectly.
Yeah, and it's basically just some sort of chemical additive to the fabric that gives it a little bit of stiffness or a little bit of extra body. I think that's kind of a good way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question here. What are some of the fabrics used in the quilt behind you?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's an easy one to answer. This quilt was one of the quilts that I made for the gallery of my book, which is Hexagons, Diamonds, Triangles, and More. I told you I love those shapes. And every single fabric in this quilt is a Kaffe facet fabric. So all of the fabrics that look solid are actually his shot cottons. And then there are just really two other prints in the quilt, the background fabric and then what I call the mountain fabric, which is the other fabric inside each one of these pieced equilateral triangles. So,
Perfect.
okay.
Awesome. I love it. So real quick, I'm going to ask you if you can turn down your speaker volume on your computer real quick. I think we're getting a little bit of a feedback. I just turned mine down too. Not that I don't love to hear my voice super loud, but
There, we'll
Awesome.
try that and see if that's better.
Okay. Speaking now a little bit more about the quilt behind you, because you mentioned at the beginning you love working with triangles, and I think that's something where a lot of people shy away from them because they can't keep the points. And obviously you have a quilt where you have to keep not just one, but all three of every single one. So what are your tips for not losing the points on triangles?
Boy, I tell you, one of the things that I think is really helpful is to start with a template that has blunted tips, so that you automatically lose a lot of the bulk that's behind the seam. Then the next thing that I would suggest is just when you're doing your seams, you can see where your previous seams are and just watch them and just stitch like literally a thread's width away from the point. And that way you've got enough room in the turn so that you don't lose your points.
That's perfect. All right, our next one, Ginger says, what is the best weight of thread to use on quilts?
Wow, there's a lot of personal preference there, but I will tell you, I use a pretty lightweight thread for piecing. So I use a 60 weight thread. I piece almost entirely with all cotton thread. My favorite one happens to be Presencia, and there's a specific reason for that, and that's because it's one of the few 3-ply cotton threads you can still find. And what that means, the ply of the thread is the number of fibers that are spun together to give you that single strand of thread. And most threads now are 2-ply. And it's a physics thing. It's, tensile strength. If you've got 3 fibers spun together to create the same weight thread as with a 2-ply thread, you automatically have some extra strength in that thread. So I really look for good quality 3-ply threads, and I usually piece with 60 weight. But thread is one of those things where there's really no right or wrong. You find what works the best for you and then go with it. So
yeah, absolutely. I have to say I'm one of those ones where whatever thread is within reach and the right color, like that's what I'm piecing with. But I've actually never done piecing, I don't think, with a lighter weight thread like that. I'm usually probably 50 weight, somewhere in there. Do you think that would help somebody if they're having issues with losing points in triangles or just having an issue with pressing seams, to one side fully, trying that lighter weight thread?
it really can make a difference because we were taught about sewing our scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that really is true, but you never know how scant until you actually start playing with the actual combination of fabric and thread that you're working with. So the two things that help determine how scant a seam allowance has to be is the thickness of the fabric you're using and the thickness of the thread that you're using. So thread weight really can make a difference. So yeah, which is one reason why I do like to go with the 60 weight or lighter weight thread.
Perfect. All right, our next one here. I'm new to quilting and would love information and advice on batting selection.
Boy, that's such a huge topic. We have so many options of batting now, and I think we're so fortunate. There's synthetic fiber battings, there's natural fiber battings, there's blends of all of those things. And a lot of it really depends on the characteristics that you want your final product to have. So for example, if you use an all cotton batting, or let me just back up and say any batting, read the label because you want to know going in how much shrinkage to expect. And it also should tell you on the batting package the recommended distance for your quilting, whether it's by hand or by machine. So it will say, for example, this batting recommends that you don't stitch any further than 3 inches apart, for example. And some of them are much more than that, which doesn't necessarily mean you really want that much space between your quilting lines. But what that's letting you know is that that's how much stitching you have to maintain the integrity of the batting through use and washing. So For example, one of my favorite quilt battings is wool. I love an all wool batting for a variety of reasons. First of all, I find it to be really comfortable to sleep under year round. It's very breathable. It's a natural fiber. It's also got some natural loftiness to it. When I talk about loftiness, I mean like airiness. So when you quilt on a wool batting, you can really see the quilting. It's just delightful, and you can get wonderful washable wool battings now that don't shrink a whole lot. But one of the main reasons that I have used wool for so long is that um, back before COVID, when I traveled and taught a lot, I have a lot of my quilts that pretty much live in suitcases, and wool batting doesn't hold a crease in the same way that cotton batting does. And so, after you've taken the quilt out of the suitcase and opened it up and let it air for a little while, those creases just sort of melt away. So, you just really have to kind of do a little study about the characteristics and how much shrinkage you want. Like, for example, a batting that's 80% cotton, 20% polyester will typically shrink 3 to 5%. And that sort of gives you that old fashioned crinkled look after you've washed it for the first time. And so if that's what you're looking for, then that blend is a great blend. But if you really don't want your batting to shrink at all, you may want to go to a very flat polyester batting, which will still look like a cotton batting, but it's not going to have that shrinkage at all. So there's just a lot of factors. So you just really want to think about your end product and then what's going to serve you.
Yeah. And I think the pointing out the shrinkage factor is really, really important, because I think a lot of people maybe get a quilt that hasn't been washed yet, and then they wash it for the first time and they aren't expecting that crinkle
Right.
look. And it can be a little bit like, oh, did I just shrink it? Did I ruin it? So knowing that going into it's a good thing.
Yeah, it really is.
Right. Jessica wants to know, what was the name of that 3-ply thread again?
The brand that I really like is Presencia. I always have a Presencia. And I just happen to know that that one is a 3-ply cotton, and I use it a lot. But I know that there are a few other all cotton 3-ply threads around. So you can just research a little bit and find some. But that's the brand that I typically use.
Perfect. And Sandra says, please tell us about your book. It sounds very helpful.
Oh, well, is it okay if I show it? I mean,
Sure.
I'm down in my
Yeah.
studio, so I have one close by.
Perfect. Yeah.
So this is my book. It's called Hexagons, Diamonds, Triangles, and More, Skill Building Techniques for 60-Degree Patchwork. And it's predominantly a block book. I mean, there are more than 80 blocks in the book. But it also it has step-by-step instructions about how to sew set-in seams by machine, because I do all of my set-in seams on my sewing machine. I'm not much of a hand stitcher, although if I were on a deserted island and the only way that I could make a quilt was by hand, I would do it. But I would much rather sit at my sewing machine. And so I do all of my set-in seams on the sewing machine. But the patterns in the book could also be adapted for English paper piecing, or could certainly be used to do traditional hand piecing if those are the techniques that you like to use. But there's just a lot of information in it, and then a whole lot of blocks, and then paper patterns for 37 templates that make the blocks, but I also have those available in acrylic form as well.
Perfect. So within the 80 blocks, can you combine a, a bunch of different ones of those all together into one quilt top? And do you have examples of that or show anything like that?
They absolutely can be adapted and used together in a variety of sizes. And I do, I could probably show you an example in the gallery of the book.
Yeah.
Let me just turn to the pretty pages of the quilt pictures. Here's an example of a quilt. It's called Grandmother's, and you can see that it's got the Dolly Madison star in the center, but then it's surrounded by a smaller size Dolly Madison star and a block that I named Siberian Squill. So there are a lot of ways to combine different sizes of blocks, and there's a lot of inspiration in the gallery of the book.
I love that. I love it. And now so just hearing you mention the names of blocks, do you know if are you able to recognize all 80 of those blocks and know exactly what their names are?
Oh, heck no. And it's so funny that you ask that because I have to say I'm kind of a math geek. So, I mean, I love geometry, I love math. And if your name were a number, I would never forget it. But names are like water through a sieve in my brain. And so I always tell people, in fact, I did a Zoom lecture for a quilt guild yesterday, and that's exactly what I told them is that naming the blocks was so much harder for me than designing the blocks because I had to come up with, 80 names for those
Yeah.
blocks. So
Yep. So I guess block number 1, block number 2, those were all out.
those were out. They really needed to have names.
Perfect. All right. Jenna says she loves the colors in the quilt behind you. Who is your favorite fabric designer? Maybe she will branch out from her pastel safety zone.
Oh my gosh, that I do definitely have some favorites. I would say that Kay Fessett, who designed all of the fabrics in the quilt behind me, is absolutely a favorite. Tula Pink, I don't think that's a surprise. She's so popular and she just comes up with some really clever things. Allison Glass is a favorite, and Anna Maria Horner are favorites. So I would say those are probably my four top. But honestly, it's rare for me to meet a fabric I don't like, and so but those are definitely some of my favorite designers.
Perfect. All right. A follow up about batting. Dee wants to know, what do you think about bamboo batting?
I have some here, and honestly, I haven't used it yet, but I've heard really good things from people about using it. I have used a batting that is part bamboo. Quilter's Dream has a batting called Orient that is cotton, silk, tencel, and bamboo blend, and I liked it very, very much. So I actually have quite a large chunk of bamboo batting here to be used, and I've got quite a stack of quilt tops, so I bet the bamboo is going to end up in at least one of them, and I anticipate liking it. And like I said, I've heard good things about it.
Good. Perfect. Well, we will await your honest review once you have used it and quilted it, and see if you like sleeping under it as much as your wool batting quilts.
I would be happy to report back.
Perfect. Karen asks, when you have several pieces of material meeting in the corner, how do you keep the center bulk down?
That's a really, really good question. Probably one of the most important ways is something that I've already mentioned, and that's using templates that have blunted tips. Or if after you cut your patchwork pieces, your template didn't have blunted tips, you can purchase corner cutters that fit different angles of corners so that you can blunt the tips yourself. And that relieves so much bulk behind the seam already. It just takes a lot of excess fabric that you just don't need and gets it out of your way. So I would say that is probably at the top of the list. But also the way that you press can really help. And I also know quilters that actually um, hammer their really bulky seams, and it really does help to flatten them out. Now, I haven't resorted to that yet. I've so far been able to press in a way that has kept it pretty flat and definitely workable. But there are a lot of interesting and very viable options to sort of help flatten out that bulk.
I also have not resorted to hammering anything, though I can imagine if you're frustrated with the design also, maybe that can help you a little bit. But speaking of different ways that you can sort of press things or manage things, I watched a video that you did that will be available on National Quilter Circle soon, but you used a little miniature rolling pin is what I'm going to call it. What was it that you were using?
It literally is a little roller, and in fact I see it. You want me to just grab it really quick?
Sure.
It's just
Yeah.
very close, very close by
I
here.
feel like your studio is much more arranged to where everything is in reach. Mine, I'd be searching in closets for days.
I have to admit, right now my studio is a hot mess, but but there we go. So this is the little roller that we're talking about, and it really is made to be a seam roller. This one is made by Violet Craft, so I can put that up so that you can see it. But I know that there are several on the market. Some that I've seen are plastic, but this one is all wood with the little metal piece that holds it together, and I really like it. I've been really pleased and impressed with how well it works. I think the heftiness of the wood definitely assists in that. So that's not to say the plastic doesn't work. I'm just saying I've never used it, and I've been really, really happy with this one. But it's a great tool to have right next to your sewing machine, because then instead of having to hop up and go over to the pressing station after every seam, it's kind of like finger pressing on steroids, I guess, because it really does help those seams lay flat in a really nice way while you get your block constructed, and then you can take it to your pressing station and really give your block a nice press.
That's perfect. I love it. Question again about batting. Can you pre-wash batting?
Actually, yes, you can. You want to be sure of what I usually do. You have to have a washing machine that you can fill your tank, fill up your machine, because so some of the what are they called, low immersion washers, or what low volume washers, you may not be able to do this, but I've got one of the older kind that you can just decide what level you want to fill your washer to, and fill it up. So I usually use it like a lukewarm water, and then I take and unfold my batting and then gently submerge it and press it down underneath the level of the water. And I usually let it sit there for maybe 10 minutes or so. And so you aren't going to agitate it. You're just going to fill your washer and let it sit. And then when I've let it sit for a few minutes, I sort of push it up against the side wall of my washer to help sort of let the batting support itself. And I'll spin it on a gentle spin to get most of the water to drain out. And then you can either lay it flat on like a sheet on the floor or something like that and let it air dry. Or depending on the batting, some of them you can even successfully run through the dryer, like on a really gentle, delicate setting as well. But you can pre-wash and pre-shrink batting.
I was just going to say, so is the reason for pre-washing it to pre-shrink it? And if so, would you need the heat of the dryer to fully pre-shrink, I guess?
That's an interesting, I would say it probably would assist. Although I can also say that I have washed some of my quilts after they're quilted with a batting that I didn't pre-wash. And even though I didn't put it in the dryer, it still has had some shrinkage to it. So I would say that it's going to shrink at least some if you don't put in the dryer. It may not shrink quite as much as if you had put it through the dryer.
Perfect. All right. Maureen asks, she says, I'm new to quilting. What are blunted tips?
Okay, well, I will show you a picture. Yeah, it just means that instead of having a pointy triangle, that you actually have a triangle where the tip has been removed. So here's my page with my triangle templates. And you can see, like this triangle, the inside line is the stitching line, and then the outside line is the cutting line. And see how the corners are blunted. They're angled off so that you don't have the point that you would have if you were just drawing a triangle. And so by blunting those corners, when you make templates or by purchasing acrylic templates that have the blunted tips like this, it really removes a lot of extra fabric bulk from places where points will converge. So it gets rid of a lot of bulk just immediately from the get-go, and that's nice.
Absolutely. A lot of bulk and a lot of not having to come back and trim things off, the little dog ears of things if you don't want to. So kind of helps
Absolutely.
save. Yeah.
It does. And it also helps you line up your pieces for piecing much easier too. Yeah.
All right. Joy wants to know what you do with all of your beautiful finished quilts.
Oh, Joy. There are piles of quilts everywhere. Just about anyway. I keep a lot of them in our spare guest room. Some of them stay packed, or at least did before this last year, stayed packed because I was traveling so regularly with them. I have quilts that hang on the wall. I have quilts that are on the back of the sofa. I have quilts on the beds. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. So I have quite a collection. I mean, you can imagine after making quilts for as many years as I have, they do accumulate. And I do give away a lot of quilts, but there are many that because I make them for specifically for teaching purposes or for writing purposes, that I have to keep them at least for a period of time, because I use them as teaching tools.
Mhm.
So they just kind of hang out around the house all over the place.
That I have the same thing. Speaking of keeping them around for teaching tools or because you're writing something about it, the quilt behind me is our upcoming NQC Quilt Block Challenge. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, be sure to do that and you can get that pattern. But since you mentioned hanging your quilts too, I'm curious about, for one, how you're hanging the one behind you now, and if you have any suggestions on how to hang quilts based on their size or shape or things like that.
Sure.
Mhm.
Um, I do add sleeves to some quilts, but I have to say most of the time I don't. Um, this particular quilt that's hanging behind me, I hung a couple of hooks on the wall and bought a curtain rod, an expandable curtain rod, and that's how I hang the quilt that's behind me. And what I used to clip it were the clear trouser hangers. So then I can just clip those down the edge of my quilt, and then have a little stick that I just lift the hanger part up and hang it over the rod, and it works really well.
Mhm.
So I do that little trick a lot. I also found some nice, they're black plastic um, grip clips, like at the hardware store, and they
Oh,
come
yeah.
in a variety of sizes, and those are really handy too. And when I travel, sometimes I'll take a quilt rack with me, a collapsible quilt rack, and I will clip my quilts to that sometimes
Mhm.
too. So it's a
Perfect.
quick and easy way when you have to take them up and down really fast.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
otherwise, yeah, hanging on the wall, I will usually use either a wooden quilt rack and then put a sleeve on, or the command strips actually can be
Oh,
really helpful. And there's ways that you could like even sew a little, like a curtain ring, plastic ring to various places along the back of your quilt, and then use command strips with the little hooks on it to hang quilts as well.
that's a great idea too. I cheated with mine since it's only up temporarily. I just pinned straight through the quilt, straight into the wall with a bunch of pins along the top.
That's perfect. I love that. And your quilt is gorgeous, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next question here, Dee says that she's used a clapper from garment sewing for seams. Have you ever tried that?
I personally haven't tried it, but I've had other people tell me they've used it too, and they've said it's worked great. So good for you.
Yeah, perfect. Callie asks, when making 8 half square triangles, should you blunt the corners?
Once again, it's personal preference. I think that it's helpful, especially if you don't have a lot of experience yet working with half square triangles and sewing them together. I think blunting the corners is very, very helpful. And
Yeah.
like I said, there are tools available on the market you can get that are little. So I think some of them are called corner cutters, corner clippers. There
Mhm.
are several different manufacturers that make them with a variety of angles. So you would need a 45-degree angle for a half square triangle. And it really, I think, is very helpful to get rid of those little, um, get rid of the dog ears before they're stitched together.
Yes. Yep. Well, that was going to be my next question. So I tend to make half square triangles oversized so I can square them up, trim them down, which inadvertently removes all, dog ears, whatever you want to call it. How do you normally do your half square triangles?
Normally, I do my half square triangle sort of the old fashioned way. So
Mhm.
I have my finished size square and add 7/8 of an inch, and that's my cut square. And then I cut it in half once on the diagonal, and there are my half square triangles. So, but
Perfect.
sometimes I will use triangle paper as well. I have done that also, especially when I've needed a lot.
So I don't know that I'm familiar with triangle paper.
One brand is called Triangles on a Roll, and basically
Mhm.
it's like printed foundation papers, and you can get them in a variety of sizes. And so you just put your two pieces of fabric right sides together, and then you fit your paper over the top, and it shows you which lines to stitch on, and then you just have to go back and tear away the papers. So
Hmm.
they're really accurate, which is nice. And Triangles on a Roll is one brand, but there are several brands available. And I know there's also a quilt program of some sort that you can actually get and print out any size that you want from your
Really?
printer. Yeah.
That's kind of cool. I'm going to have to look into those. All All right. Joy wants to know what your preferred fabric to use for backing.
Well, anything that's big enough. So basically, what I'm saying is, I don't like to piece my backings. I am so delighted that we have such a variety of wide backings to choose from because I think for me, I love piecing tops. I love piecing tops. And by the time I am finished with one, I have so many ideas going and I want to move on to the second one that for me, even just putting two pieces of fabric together to make a backing is more than I want to do. So almost always I use wide backings. But I know a lot of people that find as much joy in doing creative piecing for the back of the quilt as they do for the top of the quilt. So if you like doing that, I highly encourage you to get really creative with your backs as well. I just happen to kind of go for the quickest, easiest thing so I can get on to the next quilt. So
That's perfect. See, my quickest, easiest thing is to send that quilt top to a really talented friend of mine who just handles the rest of the process for me.
and that's yet another way to do it, and a really good one.
Yes. All right. Dorothy wants to know what your recommendations for charity quilts are, such as patterns or typical size.
Oh gosh. Um, I think probably in terms of size that a healthy size throw, probably up to maybe 60 by 80 even, but 60 by 60 is I think a really nice cuddle and lap size, but 60 by 80 will actually fit on top of a queen size bed. So I think it just kind of depends on your audience. The kind of who they think the recipients are going to be.
Mhm.
So a lot of times organizations will give you requirements that they have for a size range. So if you're thinking of making one, I would suggest checking with the charity just to make sure that if they have guidelines that you're able to follow them.
Yep.
But gosh, I think anything that we make for charity quilts is great. And so if there's a favorite block that you like to make and you just find joy making that block, then I'd say go for that one. But um, anything that you would do for a charity quilt would be wonderful and beautiful, and I know greatly appreciated.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a great way to maybe try out a new design if you know, are thinking about trying out a pattern, didn't have anything specific you wanted to make it for. It's a perfect thing to do.
It really is.
Yeah. All right. Mona asks, how do you decide what design you will use to quilt for free motion or on the long arm? And do you have any reference materials or recommend any easy design?
I do have a long arm, and I also machine quilt on my domestic machine. So I do some of each. And most of the time, I almost always do custom quilting. So I just really let the quilt top talk to me. I rarely have anything planned until I actually get it on the long arm and start just looking at it laying there in front of me at a distance. So I love to do, if I've made a really geometric quilt, like the quilt that's behind me, that's just very angular, I oftentimes will incorporate a lot of curves and a lot of movement in my quilting just to sort of help balance out all of that geometric shape that's going on. So I love to do a lot of swirly things. I do a lot of leafy, viney kinds of things, just just by hand. So I can't even tell you um, like specific patterns to look for because I just sort of draw with thread and find a great deal of satisfaction in doing that. It's just really fun. But I do know that both on National Quilter Circle and on Craftsy, there are lots of wonderful classes available that can give you some really good ideas and some good foundation, not only in technique, but in design. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those tutorials we do have on NQC even show you how you can be, you know, drawing that out and planning that out even on paper. So maybe I know a lot of times people are not wanting to jump right in and start stitching on this beautiful quilt top that they may or may not like the design. That doesn't mean that you couldn't say draw a simplified version of say the pattern you have on the quilt behind you, and then draw your quilting to sort of audition it first before you actually stitch it. Make sure you're going to like it.
absolutely. And I think that's a great idea. And so many teachers of free motion machine quilting will strongly recommend what they might call doodling or drawing or just playing with designs. And I think not only does that help you come up with a design that you like for the blocks that you have created, but it also really helps with your hand-eye coordination when you actually get to the sewing machine.
Absolutely. All right, Jenna says, what are some good backing fabrics for a picnic quilt? I don't want to use a tarp, but I want something to easily be able to brush grass off
Hmm. You might think about like a cotton duck fabric, a little bit heavier cotton fabric. I think that would probably work really pretty well on the back of a quilt, and yet it would still be soft and pliable. So that would be one that I would recommend. What do you think, Ashley?
That I wasn't thinking. Her next, she added here, is there a good canvas fabric you recommend? And so I hadn't thought about a duck cloth, but that would be very easy to brush something off of. I was more thinking of just a color wise that you wouldn't necessarily see if it got dirty or wouldn't worry about it as much. That's more of the direction my brain went. But I do like the duck or canvas type fabric would be really easy to brush off of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too.
Absolutely. All right. Pat says that she was taught on using the seam roller to not use it like a rotary cutter and push the seam ahead of the roller, but to hold it upright so as to not distort the seam. So, is there any special technique you recommend with using your roller?
I have to say I've seen a lot of people use it up and holding it up and down like this
Yeah.
to roll the seams. And I've done that a little. I have to say I typically hold it sort of like my rotary cutter, but I'm pretty gentle. I try to keep in mind the fabric and how it's laying in relation to the seam, and I try to press sort of with the grain so that I don't add any distortion to the block. So I'm always in my piecing and in my planning, I'm pretty grain conscious, and the same thing is true when I use that roller.
That's perfect. And I would think the roller would honestly be a little more gentle on the fabric than if you're trying to press with your iron because it's rolling, right? So it really shouldn't be catching the fabric and pulling it anyway. So you should,
Yeah.
yeah, perfect. Vaughn asks, after making so many quilts, do you have a favorite?
Oh, it's kind of usually my favorite is the one that I'm working on at the moment because
Absolutely. I
I'm
feel like it's
excited
everyone.
about it. Yeah. But I mean, the one behind me is one of my personal favorites. And I would say that I do have a few that I've made over the years that just really have a very special place in my heart, whether it was because I made it for somebody that was really special to me, or I just happened to really like the colors that I pulled together or the design that I used. But I would say, it's always the current one in the moment too. Is like because you're excited, you want to see it come together, and it's new, and the fabrics are usually new. So yeah.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Follow up here. There are a lot of fabrics that say 100% cotton, but they all feel so differently. Can you explain?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I can. Um, Sometimes I think it has to do with um, how tightly woven they are, because that certainly is going to feel different. And to some degree, the quality of the threads that have gone into the weave, I think, makes a difference. And sometimes, like with a cotton sateen, even though it's a 100% cotton, there's something that they have done, and I don't know the process, but that makes that cotton sateen almost shimmery to look at and very, very soft to the touch. So there are certainly things that they do, even though it's 100% cotton. There are manufacturing processes that go into place that do make a difference. So I think that there's just a variety of things, but I do think the tightness of the weave and the quality of the thread makes a difference.
Yep, I agree 100%. All right. Next question here. Patricia says, do you have any suggestions on how to finish the edges of grandmother's flower garden quilt? I think
Oh, golly.
I
That's a great question. I have a couple of suggestions. Sort of what was really traditional back in with hexagon and 60-degree quilts back from the late 1800s through the 1950s. A lot of people used just the organic edge of the patchwork piece as the edge of the quilt. And I have a beautiful, in fact, I've got a picture, a beautiful grandmother's flower garden quilt that my paternal grandmother made, which really was the inspiration for me as I was a child wanting to be a quilt maker. So I'm going to try to hold this really close. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but the edge of this quilt, she put the binding on that organic edge. So it's little hexagons, like 1-inch finished side hexagons, that the little binding is going around all of those teeny tiny edges. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front that that is never going to happen at my house. Binding is my least favorite part of the quilt anyway, and I want a straight edge to do it. And so we also see because I've collected many antique and vintage 60-degree quilts, a lot of people will cut them off. We'll just trim the edges to give yourself a straight edge. And I see no shame in that whatsoever. So if you really don't want to bind around all those edges, I would say feel free to trim it. And then one of the things that I did with my book, when I subdivided the hexagon into so many pieces, is that instead of me trimming away part of a patchwork piece, I have all of the pieces available to set in to give myself a straight edge on both the sides and the top and the bottom of my quilt top. And then I can choose to add a border or not. But I do have a straight edge with a 90-degree corner to put a binding on. So I would say, if you don't have the shapes available to create a straight edge, don't feel bad about trimming it. If you don't want to bind around all those irregular edges, you're sure not going to get any judgment from me about that, okay?
I was wondering if you're going to say you were going to do that, because then I was going to ask for your tips on binding around all of those weird shapes.
Well, I've done it a couple of times, because sometimes I will make like a hexagon shaped table topper. So then I don't have a 90-degree corner. I have like a 120-degree corner to bind around. And it really is, you still miter it. You just change the angle of your miter a little bit. So it's doable, but I don't do it very often. Let's just say that.
Fair enough. All right. All right. Next question here. Marty wants to know, what is your favorite marking tool?
Oh, golly. I really like a chalk pencil, because I find that for the most part, the lines are really easy to get rid of. But Soline is one brand that I really, really like if I need like a water erasable marker, because it's got the tip on it is not a felt tip, but I think they call it a ceramic tip. And so I don't get the fuzz that I have gotten with some other like water erasable markers. So I've been really pleased with those markers as well. But a lot of times I just, good old chalk. If it shows up on the fabric, I like chalk a lot. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Our next one, along the same lines, do you have an iron recommendation?
I recently bought a little Oliso travel iron that I just think first of all, it's the cutest little thing because it's purple. And
I got the yellow one, but I did see that one.
There you go. It's got this little silicone mat that goes underneath it, and it gets really hot. And I know that I can use it with steam. I just haven't yet, but it does allow you the option of putting water in it for steam. And I've been really pleased with it. I also have that I use in my studio a lot, a Panasonic cordless, and the cordless irons are really nice. So it's got a base that it sits in that it just recharges, but when you pull the iron out, there's no cord to mess with, and that has just been a true delight.
I should really look into that with 2 kids and 2 dogs that run around in here at all times. I have to say, though, I have the Oliso Mini Iron, but I also have the Oliso Pro, the big one, and because I love steam with everything, so I like that. But I'm gonna have to look into this cordless. That sounds awesome.
It's really nice. Now I have to say, one other thing that I did buy myself is the portable Laura Star steam iron.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh! If you like steam, that thing steams like there's no tomorrow. It's
Really?
Pretty amazing. Yeah.
Okay. I should have been taking notes. I'm gonna have to go back and watch this and take notes of things I need to look at. Good deal. All right. Brenda asks, what batting do you like for a medium to large wall quilt?
I would say for a medium to large, well, I often will use cotton, just because I really like a nice flat, low loft cotton. And there are so many varieties and so many weights. And I like the look of it. And since if it's a wall quilt, it's probably pretty rarely, if ever, going to get washed. And so then I don't have to worry about the shrink factor. But so I really like kind of a flat batting for a wall quilt. But if you were concerned about shrinkage, you can also get a really flat, low, no loft polyester batting. Quilter's Dream has a poly batting that is really flat. So it's not the puffy, squishy, lofty kind of polyester. It's a nice flat polyester, and I think that would work really well too. And it would be very lightweight for hanging on the wall.
Perfect. All right, Paula wants to know if you have a suggestion or suggestions for a true beginner's first bed quilt.
Oh, golly. Honestly, I would suggest to you to do a sampler. And there are a lot of, I think, really good books out there and some really good classes on like a progressive sampler that takes you from like a very simple block and then lets you build your skills as you move through the sampler blocks. And I think that would be a really good place for you to begin, because not only are you going to end up with blocks to make a beautiful and really interesting bed quilt, but you're going to build your skills along the way. And that's always a good thing.
I think that's a great idea. That wasn't even an option that popped into my head, but I think that's great too, because that also is going to save you from maybe getting bored of the repetitive, say a rail fence or something that's just all the same straight line, something you're getting to learn something else. So I love that.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Patricia wants to know, what is your method to sewing long strips in a straight line?
I would say that what I'm guessing that you're asking is that sometimes when we stitch long strips together, they sort of get that curve in it.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think what I would suggest would be to do the fabric preparation that I talked about earlier when I cut pieces with bias. That can also be very helpful with your strips, just to add a little bit more stability. Another thing that I think could be very helpful, and sadly, not all machines have the capability, but if your machine has the ability for you to adjust the presser foot pressure, I would suggest decreasing your presser foot pressure so that as it's going through, it's not stretching or pulling on your fabric very much, but just gently guiding it through. If you don't have that capability, you might try seaming it together with a walking foot, that you can still adjust your needle so that you get your scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, but it will sort of help propel those layers through evenly, so that should help keep it straight also.
Absolutely. Speaking of, some machines have this capability. What machine do you typically piece on?
Well, I'm a Bernina ambassador, and so I have a family of Berninas. I love my Bernina machines, and I've sewn on Berninas, gosh, since probably the early 90s. And I love them. And that's not to say there aren't other wonderful brands out there, but I am definitely a Bernina devotee. So
Perfect. And I'm assuming you also have a Bernina long arm then?
actually, I don't. I bought my long arm. I think before Bernina even had their long arms available, but I do have a Bernina sit down long arm.
Perfect.
So I have a Q20, and it's pretty sweet.
I did get to use a Q16 for a little while, and I did really, really like that too. So I can attest to that. All right. Annie wants to know, what is your favorite way to square up a quilt?
Well, I tell you, Annie, it kind of depends on whether my quilt has a border on it or not. So, and I'm assuming you're talking about after it's been quilted. So if my quilt has a border on it, that's not a pieced border, but just a solid fabric border, I will just use, usually I'll use either a rectangle ruler, like my 8.5 by 12.5 inch ruler is one that I like a lot, or a large square ruler, like at least 12.5 inches square or a little bit bigger. And I will start at an edge, and I use my seams for my border kind of as my guide to help me get a nice 90-degree corner on each corner, and then, use my seam line and just trim my borders all the way around. If I don't have a border, then sometimes I'm willing to sacrifice my quilt being completely square in order to make sure that I don't cut off points of like star blocks or whatever block might take a point. So I always use the point of my blocks and make sure that I've got, if not a full 1/4 inch, almost a 1/4 inch there so that I can get my binding on. So it just kind of depends on whether I have a quilt with a border or not. But I never sacrifice my points if I can possibly help it, because that's going to be pretty obvious. Whereas in most quilts, if it's not quite square, that'll be less obvious than a point that gets cut off.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we have a comment here. Jessica says she also has the Laura Star, and it's a life changer. Never thought I'd say that about an iron.
I agree with you. I haven't had it terribly long, and I've really been enjoying it. And the steam is just incredible. It's just amazing. So
All right,
I'm
put it
glad
on
that
my
you're
list.
taking
I'm
a
going to
good
look into it.
exchange. Yeah.
Jenna wants to know, what is the fluffiest batting?
Um, I would say probably the fluffiest batting, and I refer to loft as the fluffiness. So in my mind, that's the fluff factor. The thickness is a measurable amount. In my mind, the loftiness is how fluffy the batting is. And I would say that probably the fluffiest batting you can get is a very lofty polyester batting. Um, Cotton battings really don't tend to be lofty. If you have a cotton poly blend, they will have a little bit of fluffiness to them because of the added polyester. Wool is nice and fluffy, but you don't tend to get a really thick wool batting. So it's very fluffy. It's very airy, and it really helps your quilting stand out, but it's just not thick in terms of an amount of batting. But you can get some pretty thick, fluffy polyester batting. So if that's what you like, that's a good place to look for a fluff factor.
Perfect. All right, Linda wants to know, how long did it take you to do the quilt behind you?
Actually, I did most of that at a quilting retreat. So, where I typically sew probably anywhere from 12 to 18 hours a day when I do that. So I would say, if I had to, it's been quite a while ago that I made this, but if I had to estimate, I probably got almost the whole thing done over the course of a 4-day quilting retreat, because a lot of this one can be done chain piecing because there are no set-in seams. So,
Well, a chain piecing, and then we were talking about this right before we went live, but that it's actually done with like strip sets. I was looking at it trying to figure out how it goes together, and that kind of speeds up the process a little bit too, right?
it really does.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right, this is sort of a follow-up to when we were talking about how fabric feels, but Joanne wants to know if you know if the dye has anything to do with the feel of the fabric.
You know, I'm not sure that the dye does, but the other chemicals that are used with the processing certainly does. So it's actually the dye or whether it's the dye fixatives, although I'm guessing that of the two, it's probably the dye fixatives that really create a different feel to the fabric. And different companies use different um, chemical techniques when they are setting their dyes. So I think I think it's probably the setting chemicals that make the most difference. But what do you think?
I agree. I wouldn't see how a dye, especially since you're supposed to discolor the fabric and then kind of get washed away. So I wouldn't think that it would leave a whole lot. But I'm not sure. That's something that I've never done a whole lot of research into how fabric is made. I just enjoy it once it is. So I don't.
Me too. Me
Mhm.
too.
Yeah. All right. We have one last question here that came in, and Jenna asks, how difficult is it to bind a circle quilt? Is this an advanced skill?
I wouldn't say that it's an advanced skill, but you're certainly going to want to use bias cut binding, because you want that binding to be able to stretch and give and form itself around that circle. So as long as you're using bias cut binding, I don't think it's probably any more challenging than doing a quilt with straight edges on it. You just
Yep.
want to have that binding with that stretch.
Absolutely. And I have to say, because I normally say this 100 times during a live event, but we have a video on National Quilter Circle where we talk about different ways to do binding, how to make bias binding, how to make continuous bias binding so you don't have to, piece together a bunch of little strips. So all sorts of tips on binding that you can find on National Quilter Circle. So I want to thank you so much, Kelly, for being here to answer everyone's quilting questions over the last hour. Is there any fun tips or advice or anything you'd like to share with someone who's maybe tuned in for our first event and maybe is thinking about getting into quilting now?
Well, I think I would say that perfection is a myth. So the most important thing is to just have fun. Be brave and just experiment and take some risks with your blocks, and don't let anybody tell you that there's something that's too hard to do, because everything is learnable. And so just have a good time with it and enjoy yourself and play with color and just have fun. So, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy to be with you today, and it's been a joy to be with you all. So take good care.
Thank you so much for being here.
Bye bye now.